Yo, what is going on, Headliner Nation? We're back with a little bit of a different look today. That's what happens when you have allergies and you sneeze while you're in the middle of shaving. But if we can get past the shock of what I look like on camera after shaving for the first time in 4 years, we've got a lot of tight ends to talk about today. And it starts on Thanksgiving Day with Green Bay at Detroit. And this is supposed to be Tucker Kraft versus Sam Laporta, but they're both done for the season. So now we get Luke Musgrave and Brock Wright, and neither of them have showed anything at this point in time that would warrant starting them in fantasy football. Luke Musgrave, the former second-round pick, is now losing snaps to John Fitzpatrick, so he's essentially lost his job twice now. And Brock Wright, he had 4 targets last week, and I do think that he has a chance to score in basically every game the rest of the season. He's going to be utilized in the red zone at times, but Jahmyr Gibbs and Amon-Ra St. Brown combined for 25 targets last week. It's going to be those guys and hopefully some more Jameson Williams moving forward. The mid-afternoon game on Thursday is going to be Kansas City at Dallas, and Travis Kelce, prior to last week, had 3 straight games being inside the top 12 tight ends. Now, last week he would have been inside the top 12 again had it not been for a horrible face mask call that took away a touchdown of his. So I have him listed as a fringe start this week, and honestly, he's probably a lot closer to being an actual start when you take a look at the tight ends that we feel like we can trust this week. But for Travis Kelce, I am a little bit concerned about how well the Dallas defense has played as of late, and if that's going to cause any issues for Patrick Mahomes. I also had him listed as a fringe start because I wasn't sure about Rashee Rice, but he looks like he is going to be good to go. So I'll list Travis Kelce as a fringe start because I do think Rashee Rice is the one that sees the majority of the targets once again this week. Kansas City is allowing the 9th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends right now, and Jake Ferguson really hasn't been the picture of high upside play like he was earlier in the season. Now, in terms of his floor, it's not awful. He has 50 or more receiving yards in 2 of his last 3 games, and he has at least 5 targets in 3 straight games. So if you're looking for a guy to give you a decent floor, he's not the worst one in the world. Cincinnati at Baltimore on Thursday Night Football. The nightcap, Joe Burrow is going to be returning, and who is going to be his main target? Probably Jamar Chase, and who will be a secondary target with T. Higgins out. Mike Gesicki, in his return from the IR last week, had 6 targets, but I'm not necessarily convinced that Mike Gesicki or Noah Fant will be the answer at tight end this week, considering Baltimore allows the 7th fewest fantasy points per game. Harry's did an excellent job helping me clean up for the first time in over 4 years, and Mark Andrews, I think he needs to clean it up as well. And that's why he's going to be my Harry's Clean It Up Player of the Week at the tight end position, because Mark Andrews is in an excellent spot this week, going up against Cincinnati, who allows the most fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends. Mark Andrews hopefully will smash this week. Tight ends have scored a touchdown against the Cincinnati Bengals in 6 of their last 7 games. And Hunter Henry is coming off a huge day where he caught 7 passes for 115 yards and a touchdown. Mark Andrews finding the end zone this week is absolutely doable. In this holiday season, if you need help cleaning up a little bit, or if you want to get some stocking stuffers or gifts for people in your life, then Harry's is exactly the place to go. And right now for our viewers, you can use the link down in the description below to get their Harry's Plus trial kit for only $10. Test it out for yourself. And also, Harry's has a ton of other things that you can use as stocking stuffers and great gifts this holiday season. Chicago and Philadelphia will get together on Black Friday this week. And if you're going to be shopping from home for any deals, then make sure you head over to tfhdraftguide.com and pre-order your 2026 fantasy football draft guide for a discounted price for this weekend only. If you don't feel like 2025 went your way and you want to start preparing for 2026, then get ahead of the game and pre-order our draft guide this weekend. If 2025 has been a successful season so far, then you should still prepare for next year to make sure that you back up any fantasy championships you win this year. Philadelphia is allowing the 2nd fewest fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends, but Colston Loveland has been playing very well as of late, and Ben Johnson is finally getting him involved in the game plan. He has at least 40 receiving yards in each of his last 4 games, with 3 touchdowns during that time span. And he's only averaging about 4 targets per game over his last 6 games, which is not a ton of volume, but his yards per reception right now is over 12. So even though he's getting a little bit lower volume, he's doing an awful lot with it too. Dallas Goedert has really fallen off a cliff since the bye week. This is a great matchup to get back on track, but can we trust him? Chicago's allowing the 8th most fantasy points per game, but since their bye, he's been the tight end 19, 32, and 33. Prior to their bye week, he had 7 touchdowns in 7 games. He hasn't had any touchdowns since then. He really needs to find the end zone again. San Francisco at Cleveland, and George Kittle is back to being all reliable after Brock Purdy returned from his injury. As long as Brock Purdy is the starting quarterback for the San Francisco 49ers, we can expect a top 5 potential day from George Kittle every week. San Francisco's allowing the 7th most fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends, but I have absolutely no faith in David Njoku. He only played 49% of the snaps last week, and he didn't even have a single target. Harold Fannin is the guy that you want to try and roll with. He led the team in targets with Shedeur Sanders last week, who will be starting again this week, and he's playing by far way more snaps than David Njoku. Harold Fannin is on the field 90% of the time right now. Britton Strange had a very successful return from the IR last week. He caught all 5 of his targets for over 90 yards and showcased some of that big playability. But this matchup going up against Tennessee may end up being a little bit tougher, as Tennessee is allowing the 8th fewest fantasy points per game. Is Britton Strange a guy I think we can just automatically toss back into our lineup right away? No, I don't think so. And if Brian Thomas Jr. is able to play this week, I think that complicates things even further. So for right now, he's only a fringe start. If Brian Thomas Jr. doesn't play, I do think he's a little bit safer at that point, but I can't list him as a must start yet. Chigiooko or Gunnar Helm? That's not a question I thought I'd be asking myself here in week 13. But they have a great matchup against Jacksonville, who currently allows the 2nd most fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends. And Gunnar Helm has received quite a bit of targets over the last couple of weeks. Over the past 2 weeks combined, Gunnar Helm has saw 12 targets, and he had over 50 receiving yards last week. Chigiooko, not nearly as many targets as Gunnar Helm, but he's still showcasing some big playability. They both played 63% of the offensive snaps last week, and it's clear that Cam Ward is looking their way right now. If you want to go with a safer option, I would say it's Gunnar Helm. I would pick him to play this week before I would pick Chigiooko, but we know Chigiooko can get some big plays as well, so I have to list him as a fringe start, but only in the most dire circumstances. If you used Dalton Schultz last week, he absolutely killed you. He only had 4 targets, and he caught just 1 of those for 8 yards. This week against Indianapolis, solid matchup. They're allowing the 6th most fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends. But you really have to hope that Dalton Schultz bounces back and does not leave you hanging again. I don't love this matchup for any player on the Indianapolis Colts, and Tyler Warren is not an exception to that, because Houston is allowing the 6th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends. And they are a really tough defense. Indianapolis is going to have their hands full this week. And if Daniel Jones has any turnovers, that's going to equal less opportunities for this offense, including Tyler Warren. I'll list him as a start still because he deserves to be a start. He is a guy that sees more than enough targets to still have a floor of 5 to 6 fantasy points, but I don't know how much higher he goes than that. There's going to be a lot of questions this week about Taysom Hill. Let me start with Juwan Johnson. Juwan Johnson is a start for me going up against Miami, who's currently allowing the 4th most fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends. He's been a top 12 tight end each of the last 5 weeks, so he deserves to be a start, and he deserves to be the first option at tight end this week in the matchup. However, Taysom Hill is going to be a fringe start for me, and I hate to do that. If you've been watching this channel for a while, you know exactly how I feel about Taysom Hill. But last week after Alvin Kamara went down with his injury, Taysom Hill had 10 carries. There's a chance that he could go double-digit carries again this week. And if New Orleans can get into the red zone, there's also a good opportunity that Taysom Hill may get a goal line carry or 2. A touchdown is definitely in the cards this week. Not really a whole lot to say about Greg Dulcich. Since he returned to the field this season, he's been the tight end 36, 34, 20, and 82. Darren Waller's the only tight end that's gotten any type of fantasy value for the Dolphins this year. I kind of wanted to list Kyle Pitts as a sit this week just to basically punish him for a terrible performance in a great matchup last week. but it's not really his fault. It's like when one of your kids does something stupid and you want to punish them for it, but then you find out that the other kid is the one that essentially talked him into it. You're mad at both of them at that point. The same way I'm mad at Kyle Pitts and Kirk Cousins. I'll leave Kyle Pitts as a fringe start this week. Going up against the Jets, who played extremely well on defense last week, I think it's a risky play at best. We have a lot of solid options at the tight end position this week, and with how Mason Taylor's been so up and down, and now a tough matchup against Atlanta, who allows the third fewest fantasy points to opposing tight ends, I'm out on Mason Taylor for the time being. Just leave him on your bench and go with somebody else. Trey McBride was not able to find the end zone last week, which snapped a streak of 5 straight games with a touchdown and 6 touchdowns in those 5 games. He definitely could get back into the end zone this week, but even if he doesn't, he still has 3 straight games with at least 10 targets, and we know he's probably going to see 7 or more targets pretty easy. He's a safe start. This is a great matchup for Cade Otton this week. Arizona allows the 9th most fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends. And as of this recording, we still don't know if Baker Mayfield is going to be able to play. So if he doesn't, Teddy Bridgewater and a lot of his short dump-offs could end up going to Cade Otton. For the Rams this week, I may be going out on a limb here, and this might be a little bit of a risky call, but I'm going to list Colby Parkinson as a start. He has a touchdown in 3 straight games, and the Rams are clearly relying on the pass, with Matthew Stafford being an MVP candidate right now. This is a tougher matchup for their wide receiver, so it's not out of the question that he doesn't look to Colby Parkinson once again this week, especially when they get into the red zone. I would risk it with Colby Parkinson over several other tight ends that we've discussed as fringe starts. And for the tight ends in Carolina, uber talented, not utilized, and not fantasy viable. I think there are way better options this week at tight end than TJ Hockenson. And maybe some of you are like, hey, the undrafted rookie Max Brosmer, maybe he's going to be the one to unlock TJ Hockenson, but I'm not going to go with it. I'm not even going to risk it. It's a tougher matchup. Seattle allows the 3rd fewest fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends. He sees 3-4 targets per week, doesn't do a whole lot with them. Maybe he scores a touchdown if they can move the ball into the red zone, but other than that, I'm going to go with somebody else. AJ Barner went from double-digit targets to only 4 targets last week. That's the roller coaster that AJ Barner has been for the most part this season. But with this being a tougher matchup at the wide receiver position for everyone outside of Jackson Smith-Njigba, I'm hoping that AJ Barner can get closer to 8 targets this week and have a solid floor. As of right now, Dalton Kincaid is still questionable, but this is a solid matchup against Pittsburgh, who allows the 5th most fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends. If Dalton Kincaid can play this week, he'll definitely be a start for me. And again, we never know what's going to happen at the tight end position for the Pittsburgh Steelers. Yeah, Pat Freiermuth scored last week, but how often are we actually putting these guys in our lineup? It's a terrible matchup as well. Buffalo allows the fewest fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends. You have to play Brock Bowers. That's just where we're at this point of the season. We know that he has a high ceiling, but we know that he hasn't reached it recently. We know that he has a solid floor, although we would like that floor to turn into a little bit more of a ceiling. It's a tough matchup. Going up against the Chargers, they allow the 5th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends. But if you own Brock Bowers, realistically, what other tight end do you have that you can play and feel as comfortable with? It's going to be interesting to see what we get from Oronde Gadsden this week because he has really fallen off a cliff. Number one, it is a tougher matchup. Las Vegas is allowing the 4th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends. But for Gadsden, it's more about what we've seen the last couple of weeks, where he's only combined for 44 receiving yards. Now, Justin Herbert's been banged up, and Gadsden was banged up in one of those games. So I'm going to give him a little bit of a pass right now, and hopefully coming out of the bye, everyone is way more healthy. Denver at Washington on Sunday Night Football, and yet another week of talking about how Evan Ingram is underutilized, not fantasy viable, and Sean Payton is a damn liar. This week, Zach Ertz does not have a ton of upside for me. Zach Ertz to me is more of a low floor play. 4 to 6 targets, maybe 40 receiving yards. Hasn't had a very high upside with Marcus Mariota, and it looks like Terry McLaurin will be back this week. The Giants and the Patriots on Monday Night Football, and I'm looking towards Theo Johnson as being a start this week. Right now, New England's allowing the 10th most fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends, but they've been tough on all the other positions. So hopefully Theo Johnson gets some looks this week, especially with Jackson Dart on the way back. Hey, Hunter Henry, I absolutely appreciate it. You came through for us last week. We listed you as a start and a guy to stream in such a great matchup, and you helped out fantasy owners. Back to the waiver wire, bro. Not even close to our lineups. Headliner Nation, hopefully you got a ton of information out of this tight end video, and hopefully your lineups are starting to look a little bit better and you're feeling more comfortable with who you're going to be playing this week. Remember, check your lineups for everybody going on Thursday. But more importantly, stay safe and stay healthy. And I'll catch you all on the next episode of the Fantasy Headliners.